With every breath in my body, I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
The economic understanding and the geopolitical understanding both began to break down by the 2010s. And I think that's when you have actually the crisis building up. And I think Trump just pushes it over the edge.
So this week in Raja Mandala, in your column, you've looked at, of course, Trump's impending presidency. He'll take office in January, and what that means for multilateral institutions, major, big groupings, international groupings of countries. In his first term, Trump, famously against NATO and America being the sort of security provider for Europe and beyond, had taken exception to that, saying why American taxpayers should be doing this. Why should they be bearing the burden at the expense of things that could be happening in America? But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, in the last 10 years, as you mentioned in your piece, there has, perhaps one could argue even beyond to some extent, both the efficacy and the halo around a lot of multilateral institutions, whether it's the UN especially, but the World Trade Organization, other slightly smaller groupings, has eroded. Do you think Trump was just a sort of pushing forward what was otherwise a slow decay being kept up by all of us, policy, people who have a vested interest from foreign affairs, just pageantry rather than substance in a lot of this stuff?
No, you're right. See, because the peak of the multilateralism was really in the 1990s and the 2000s, when there was no great power conflict, and there was a general agreement by all the major powers that globalization was good. That understanding, both the economic understanding and the geopolitical understanding, both began to break down by the 2010s. And I think that's when you have actually the crisis building up. And I think Trump just pushes it over the edge. For example, on the WTO and trade issues, where he really walked away from the assumptions about globalization. And Biden has largely persisted with it because they kept the tariffs against China. They kept the question of protecting American market, and that became the normal policy. On the broader issues on climate change, actually, as the costs of distributing the costs of adapting to green transition, as they became clear in the domestic politics, the support for climate change actions began to dissipate in the Western democracies, and the US, of course, where Trump channeled that sentiment, and Europe too today is no longer the kind of universal support that existed for it. It doesn't, and I think Trump, when he comes back, he's going to walk out of the climate change agreement. So that's going to be a climate change issue. It will be finally now make it look like it's going to be impossible to negotiate a collective agreement on that.
The second thing, as you've said, you just mentioned, Trump is going to probably walk out of some significant trade deals. He will probably again walk out once again of the Paris Agreement. The future of NATO, as we know it, might be a bit uncertain. It's a Cold War era alliance now, and especially with the Russia-Ukraine war ongoing. Do you see now also, so you've spoken of multilaterals in other sense, but do you see countries having to choose, or like India, is there going to be a lot more breaking of camps as these sort of polarizations sharpen vis-a-vis China, perhaps with America?
I think this issue will come up at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. This is one area, Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, where US and China came so close economically, starting from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Today, you're trying to undo that. So much of the region actually benefited from access to both the US and the Chinese markets. So it's been a good thing for many countries in East Asia and in the Pacific. But today, US and China locked in a geopolitical conflict as well as an economic conflict. The whole question of managing Asian economic integration is going to be severely tested. There, I think the debate within East Asia, how do they navigate this? For example, if you have cloud computing, do the East Asians work on two separate uh, clouds, or how do they prevent one from mixing with the other? So the point you made about should we choose or try to deal with both in separate ways, those issues I think are going to get sharper as Trump begins to push the agenda on decoupling and de-risking much more vigorously than Joe Biden's presidency.
So there's India, as you mentioned in the piece, everyone should read the piece. It's on the indianexpress.com and it should be in the description of wherever you're watching this video. So in the piece, you'd mentioned this, that India actually, in a sense, we've been, the government has, again, over the last decade and maybe a little more, been engaged in what are now called minilaterals, smaller groups with specific interests. So you'll have the Quad is one, of course, big example of, not officially a security arrangement, of course, but like-minded sort of powers in the Indo-Pacific. We may well end up doing more with BRICS as time goes on. One does not know, which is again in which China happens to be. You have some things going on with Iran, and you have IMEC, which is a separate corridor. One, is this sustainable? And two, two schools of thought that this will help. These kinds of things, contradictions, will eventually force you to sort of pick sides, or will more and more countries, if America's whether it's interventionism or international role recedes, will more and more countries, middle power especially, be looking to make these sort of ideology agnostic arrangements?
Yeah, I think the problem is the globalization and the many of the arrangements that came up in the turn of the 20th century are today, are under breaking point because of the US-China tensions. And I think given the size of the US and Chinese economies, it's not very easy to even if the middle powers all come together, to really alter the big picture. Because as we said in the BRICS, you put all the other 9 members together, they're still smaller than China, including Russia, India, and a whole lot of others. So I think as long as the system doesn't work for US and China, it's going to be hard to build a system beyond those two. In the BRICS, actually, China is trying to build an alternative. We sit there, but I don't think we are comfortable with the BRI and other things. So therefore, I think the question is issue-specific coalitions will have to be built, including either US or China, because that's the only way you can have a functional project. But my sense is India will find it hard to really build long-term issue-based coalitions with China, at least at this point, given the contradictions between Delhi and Beijing. But on the Western side, there seems to be a lot more convergence. For example, India is a member of the Quad. It is a member of the Mineral Security Partnership. We're doing joint AI development. We're also looking at space cooperation. So in many areas, your minilaterals will be more Western dominated rather than China dominated. But I think India will try and keep its options open still.
So the final question, you touched on this earlier, but it's the whole thing, climate. Yes, Trump may well pull out of the Paris Accord, which is one of the big, climate changes presented and may well be an existential threat. Just disarmament used to be also one of it still is in some sense, these which require global solutions. Certain global problems would require global solutions, but it's not as though the Biden administration may have stayed in. But the fundamental issue of, say, climate financing, one hasn't been able to, the global community hasn't been able to deal with. Do you think this is, in one sense, that one of those opportunities for India, beyond, the current sort of general slogans of saying, maybe we take the lead on things like this because India has met its targets. It still requires major international cooperation beyond this minilateral level.
See, I think I think large countries like India will have to invest in technological development. Because instead of waiting for a global solution, you have to invest in renewable energy. You have to create new green technologies. India has the size, the capacity to do it. China is doing it on its own. So the unilateral focus on technological development, US, of course, is doing it in a big way. A second, coalitions. And the third, see what can be done at the multilateral level. So I think you'll have to work at all the 3 levels: national, bilateral. On trade, there's going to be a lot more bilateral deals. Technological cooperation, there's also going to be a lot of bilateral deals. And then you have the plurilateral or the minilateral arrangements. So till multilateralism becomes more positive in its orientation, that we have no choice, I think, but to focus on all the 3 levels: national, bilateral, and minilateral.
Thank you so much, sir. Everyone, read the piece. It's on the IndianExpress.com, and we'll talk again next week. So thanks a lot.